The sun rose over the small provincial town of An Locc in early April 1972, painting the countryside in shades of gold and green that seemed almost peaceful. But peace was an illusion. The entire region hummed with tension. Intelligence reports had been coming in for weeks. The North Vietnamese army was mobilizing, moving large formations south toward Quang Tri and Saigon. An Locc, a sleepy town of rice paddies and low stone buildings, had been identified as a strategic choke point on Route 13, the main highway to the capital. If the NVA seized it, Saigon would be vulnerable, and the momentum of the Easter offensive would surge uncontrollably. The 5th Infantry Division of the ARVN had been ordered to hold the town at all costs. For many of the soldiers stationed there, the orders were simple: defend An Locc until reinforcements arrived. But the enemy they were about to face was unlike any they had ever encountered. Early reports estimated that over 30,000 PAVN troops, supported by artillery, tanks, and sappers, were converging on the town. Numbers like these were enough to make even the bravest commanders pause. Lieutenant Colonel Nguyen Ba Luan, the commanding officer of the 31st Regiment, paced the command bunker as reports streamed in. Radios buzzed constantly with fragmented messages. Enemy movements in the north, south, and west. Units were being deployed to block bridges, reinforce the town center, and dig in wherever possible. The ARVN soldiers, many of whom were young and inexperienced, listened to the distant rumble of artillery with growing unease. By mid-morning, the first signs of the assault appeared. PAVN reconnaissance teams moved through the outskirts, probing the perimeter. Machine gun fire rang out sporadically, but it was only a warning. The calm of the countryside was shattered when the first artillery shells landed just outside the town limits. The impact was immediate. Buildings shook, dust clouds billowed, and the smell of burning thatch and gunpowder filled the air. Civilians began evacuating, carrying what little they could salvage. Many had been warned of the NVA's approach, but the speed of the advance caught everyone by surprise. Inside the command bunker, maps were spread across tables. Radio operators scrambled to track the movement of enemy battalions. Lieutenant Colonel Nguyen Ba Luang issued orders with a tight jaw. Infantry squads were assigned to key intersections. Machine guns emplaced along the rooftops of larger buildings, and tanks positioned to cover the main road through the town. Every available soldier was deployed in preparation for the siege. As the day wore on, the first waves of the PAVN assault struck. Infantry units advanced under heavy artillery cover, supported by tanks moving cautiously through the rice paddies. The defenders of An Locc met them with everything they had: rifle fire, mortars, and well-aimed machine guns. Despite being outnumbered, the ARVN forces held their ground, forcing the enemy into a series of deadly stop-and-start engagements. By evening, the town was transformed into a battlefield. Smoke rose from shattered buildings. Fires burned along the edges of the town, fed by explosions and tracer rounds. The streets, once quiet and lined with small shops, now became choke points where men fought desperately to slow the advancing tide. Civilians who had failed to evacuate huddled in basements and under stairwells, listening to the deafening cacophony of battle above them. The first night of the siege was the true test. The PAVN continued probing attacks under darkness, while the ARVN defenders held machine guns and flares ready to illuminate any movement. The town was isolated, surrounded by enemy forces on all sides. Supply lines had yet to be cut entirely, but reinforcements could not arrive quickly enough. Every soldier knew that the hours ahead would determine not only the fate of An Locc, but potentially the entire southern defense line of South Vietnam. Artillery pounded continuously through the night, creating a rhythm of terror and destruction. Every shell that landed near the defensive lines shredded sandbags, collapsed walls, and sent mud and water spraying across trenches. Yet the defenders remained determined. Small squads counterattacked any penetration, retaking buildings and street corners, often losing half their men in the process. The battle became a grim, grinding war of attrition, fought block by block, house by house. By dawn, the town was scarred, but still standing. The defenders had survived the first day of what would become a grueling 66-day siege. The enemy had been relentless, yet An Locc had not fallen. For the soldiers inside the town, there was no celebration, only exhaustion, grim determination, and the knowledge that the NVA would return in even greater force.
The second day of the siege began with a grim certainty. An Locc would not yield. The streets were quiet, in a deceptive way, the silence punctuated only by the occasional distant shell and the soft moan of wounded men trapped in collapsed buildings. Yet outside the perimeter, the NVA moved like a vast living tide, consolidating positions, positioning artillery, and preparing for a full-scale assault. Over 30,000 troops surrounded the town, each battalion coordinated with ruthless precision. They knew that speed and coordination were critical. Delays could allow reinforcements to arrive. For the defenders, every moment was agony. Lieutenant Colonel Nguyen Ba Luong convened his staff in the command bunker, a once ordinary provincial building now transformed into the nerve center of the defense. Maps were covered in red and blue ink, showing enemy positions, friendly units, and the locations of civilians. Reports arrived in a steady stream, almost too fast to process. "Enemy tanks sighted 2 kilometers north," one officer shouted. "Artillery barrage on the western approach," called another. Outside, the town's rooftops rattled as explosions shook chimneys and dislodged roof tiles. The smell of burning straw and wood permeated the air, blending with gunpowder and sweat. The ARVN soldiers moved with disciplined urgency. Small squads were assigned to patrol the streets, checking barricades and reinforcing weak points. Heavy machine guns were positioned on rooftops, while recoilless rifles covered the main road. Every building was a potential fortress, every alley a killing zone. Civilians were evacuated whenever possible, but many remained trapped or unwilling to leave. Their eyes reflected fear, disbelief, and a quiet courage that often went unnoticed amidst the chaos of war. By mid-morning, the first large-scale NVA assault began. Infantry advanced behind a curtain of mortars and artillery, supported by armored vehicles moving cautiously through rice paddies and muddy roads. The defenders fired relentlessly. Every street corner, every doorway became a focal point of resistance. The clash of rifles and the roar of explosions created a rhythm of violence, a symphony of destruction that neither side could escape. Captain Lum led a platoon through the northern sector, a stretch of town that had already suffered significant damage. Shell craters littered the roads and collapsed walls formed obstacles that forced soldiers to move carefully, crouching low to avoid sniper fire. Through the haze, Lum spotted NVA infantry attempting to flank a small barricade. He raised his hand, signaling his men to halt. Then, with precision, they unleashed a coordinated volley of fire. The attackers staggered, but more continued to pour into the streets. The fighting was relentless, with no respite in sight. The siege stretched into the evening. Food and water became scarce, forcing soldiers and civilians alike to ration what little they had. Medical personnel worked tirelessly, treating wounds from gunfire, shrapnel, and burns. Blood stained the floors and walls of hastily converted clinics. The air was thick with smoke, the acrid smell of explosives, and the scent of fear. Every night brought renewed assaults, each more desperate than the last. The Pavans sought to overwhelm the defenders with sheer numbers, attempting to breach the town through multiple points simultaneously. Yet every attempt was met with fierce resistance. At night, the defenders used flares to illuminate the streets. The sudden bursts of light revealed advancing enemy soldiers, machine gun emplacements, and tanks moving slowly towards key positions. Each flare also exposed the defenders' locations, forcing them to move constantly. Snipers and artillery observers took advantage of every opening. The town became a chessboard of movement, each side anticipating the other's strategy, each step a calculation between survival and death. By the fourth day, the PAVN adjusted tactics. Instead of massed frontal assaults, they began probing attacks, small units infiltrating weak points, attempting to sow confusion and panic. The ARVN responded with counterattacks, reclaiming streets and intersections, often at tremendous cost. Each success was tempered by the knowledge that every building retaken might be lost again in hours. The town itself became a symbol of endurance, a microcosm of the larger struggle for South Vietnam. Supplies were running dangerously low. Ammunition stocks dwindled, and food became a precious commodity. Resupply convoys risked annihilation under enemy fire, and communication lines were fragile. Yet morale, while fraying, remained intact through determination, discipline, and the bond formed in the crucible of combat. Soldiers relied on each other for survival, often risking their lives to carry wounded comrades to safer positions or to rescue civilians trapped under rubble. As the night fell on the seventh day, an eerie quiet descended for a brief moment. Then, as if on cue, the NVA renewed its attack. Explosions tore through the streets, tracer rounds illuminated the darkness, and the defenders engaged in brutal, close-quarters combat. Every street, every ruined building, every hallway became a battlefield. Men fought for every inch, and retreat was not an option. An Loc's fate hung by a thread. By dawn of the seventh day, both sides were exhausted, yet the fighting showed no sign of abating. The town was a ruin of collapsed roofs, smoldering debris, and shattered walls. Streets had become rivers of mud and water churned by heavy vehicles and the constant movement of soldiers. Yet, against all odds, An Loc remained standing. The ARVN had held the line. For now.
By the middle of the second week, An Locc had become a town unrecognizable. Streets that once carried bicycles and market carts were now pitted with shell craters, strewn with debris, and lined with barricades of sandbags and overturned vehicles. The air carried a metallic tang, a mixture of gunpowder, smoke, and mud. The distant thunder of artillery was constant, punctuated by the shriek of incoming rockets and the crackle of small arms fire. For the defenders, there was no respite, only the relentless knowledge that the enemy was pressing ever closer. Lieutenant Colonel Gwen Baluring walked through the command bunker, the weight of responsibility pressing on his shoulders. Reports indicated that multiple regiments of the PAVN had surrounded the town completely, cutting off nearly all access to resupply routes. Food, water, and medical supplies were critically low. Every decision he made now carried consequences that could be measured in human lives. Outside, Captain Lim led a squad through the northern sector, which had become a labyrinth of ruined houses and rubble-strewn alleys. Enemy forces attempted to infiltrate through small breaches, often disguised as civilians fleeing the area. Lim's men had to be constantly alert, checking every doorway, every shadow, every movement. The tension was unbearable. One misstep could lead to an ambush, a sudden firefight, or a deadly mine. The NVA, realizing that conventional massed assaults were yielding limited results, shifted tactics. Artillery and mortar fire increased in intensity, shelling key defensive positions relentlessly. Engineers and sappers worked at night to cut through barricades and plant explosives on critical buildings. Tanks and armored vehicles pressed against the edges of the town, forcing defenders to react quickly or lose strategic positions. Every street, every house, every courtyard became a potential death trap. Inside the town, the defenders adapted. They fortified positions using whatever was available, tables, doors, rubble, and established overlapping fields of fire. Mortar teams were constantly on the move, relocating to avoid counter-battery fire. Communication lines were maintained through runners and radios, despite the constant threat of disruption. Soldiers shared what little food they had, and medical personnel worked tirelessly to treat the wounded under fire, improvising with every available resource. Heroism became the currency of survival. Young privates carried their wounded comrades to safer positions under heavy fire, often risking their own lives. Officers like Luring coordinated counterattacks that regained critical streets, buying precious hours for the town's inhabitants. Civilians, many of them women and children, assisted in carrying water, distributing rations, and providing first aid. Every act of bravery, no matter how small, became a thread holding the town together. By the 10th day, the intensity of the siege reached a peak. The ARVN launched coordinated assaults from multiple directions simultaneously. The roar of artillery, the screech of rockets, and the crackle of small arms fire merged into a constant, unending cacophony. The defenders were forced to rotate positions frequently, conserving their strength while maintaining pressure on the attackers. Snipers picked off enemy observers, machine guns cut down advancing squads, and every inch of ground was contested fiercely. Supply drops by air became crucial. Helicopters hovered over the town under heavy fire, delivering ammunition, food, and medical supplies. Each successful drop was celebrated as a small victory, but many helicopters were lost, and some supplies fell into enemy hands. The defenders adapted to these setbacks, improvising and sharing resources to ensure that no position was left undefended. Throughout the siege, the human toll was immense. Buildings crumbled under artillery fire, civilians were caught in crossfire, and soldiers faced exhaustion and trauma beyond what most could endure. Yet morale, though tested daily, remained resilient. Leaders inspired their men not with promises of glory, but with sheer determination, urging them to hold the line and survive. One of the most critical positions was the central intersection of the town, where several key streets converged. Losing this point would have allowed the enemy to penetrate the heart of An Lộc. Captain Lim and his squad held the intersection for 3 days straight, facing waves of enemy attacks. Mortar teams behind them fired continuously, and reinforcements were sent sporadically, often arriving under heavy fire. Every day they watched friends fall, yet they remained steadfast, repelling the enemy and buying time for the rest of the town to fortify. Night brought no relief. The NVA employed darkness to infiltrate positions, relying on stealth and surprise to undermine the defenders. Flares illuminated the battlefield sporadically, revealing enemy movements, but also exposing the defenders. Close-quarters combat became inevitable, and the streets of An Locke were filled with the chaotic sounds of battle, gunfire, explosions, shouting, and the screams of the wounded. By the end of the second week, the town had become a fortress, but one stretched to its limits. Communications with higher command were tenuous. Supplies were minimal, and every soldier had endured almost 2 weeks of relentless combat. Yet the defenders held. The town had not fallen. An Locke had become a symbol of resistance, a testament to the courage, ingenuity, and determination of its defenders against overwhelming odds.
By the 3rd week, An Locke was nearly unrecognizable. The town, once filled with bustling streets, markets, and homes, had become a fortress carved from rubble and fear. Shell craters dotted every road. Buildings were gutted by fire, and smoke hung perpetually in the air. The NVA assault had intensified, their forces now attacking simultaneously from multiple directions. Mortars and artillery hammered defensive positions without pause, while infantry infiltrated weak points in an attempt to breach the town's heart. Lieutenant Colonel Nguyen Ba Luong moved through the command center, the exhaustion visible on his face, yet his determination unwavering. Reports indicated that enemy numbers were staggering. Estimates placed them at 30,000 troops with armored support and heavy artillery. Despite the overwhelming odds, the defenders of An Locke had adapted, using the town itself as a weapon. Streets, alleys, and buildings became layered defensive lines. Every roof, doorway, and hallway had been fortified, making every inch of progress for the enemy costly and dangerous. The defenders' strategy relied on discipline, coordination, and relentless firepower. Machine guns, mortars, and recoilless rifles were deployed to cover intersections, choke points, and likely avenues of enemy advance. Soldiers were rotated to maintain alertness, medics treated casualties under fire, and supply drops by helicopter kept ammunition and food flowing into the city. Civilians, though terrified, aided the defense, carrying water, assisting the wounded, and reinforcing barricades. Every person played a role, turning the town into a living, breathing fortress. As the siege entered its fourth week, the NVA began one of its most aggressive assaults. Tanks rumbled through the outskirts, supported by artillery barrages that shook the foundations of every building. Infantry surged forward, attempting to penetrate street by street. The defenders, however, responded with precision. Tank destroyers and recoilless rifles targeted the armored vehicles, while machine gun nests tore into advancing infantry. The streets erupted into a violent choreography of destruction, each moment a test of endurance, courage, and skill. Captain Lamb led a counterattack to reclaim a crucial street corner that had fallen into enemy hands. His men fought through collapsing walls, dodging sniper fire and grenades, moving room by room to push the enemy back. The fighting was close quarters, brutal, and exhausting. When they finally secured the position, the streets were littered with debris, smoke, and the evidence of countless lives lost. Yet victory came in small measures, one block at a time. Helicopter resupply became critical during these days. Under heavy fire, pilots delivered ammunition, food, and medical supplies directly into the beleaguered town. Each successful drop was a morale boost, each loss a reminder of the fragile line between life and death. Soldiers risked their lives to retrieve supplies under enemy fire, often dragging the wounded to safety while bullets whistled past. The courage of these men and women kept An Locc from falling. As the siege stretched into the fifth and sixth weeks, fatigue and trauma weighed heavily on everyone. Soldiers had endured days of continuous combat, minimal rest, and constant fear. Civilians had lived in basements and makeshift shelters, surrounded by destruction and death. Yet the defenders' resolve did not falter. They had become a symbol of determination, refusing to yield despite overwhelming odds. The turning point came when ARVN reinforcements, supported by U.S. air power, began arriving. Helicopters, fighter jets, and artillery strikes disrupted enemy formations, targeting supply lines and artillery positions outside the town. This external pressure, combined with the unbroken resistance inside An Locc, began to shift momentum. Enemy attacks slowed, became less coordinated, and the siege, though still deadly, lost some of its initial intensity. During the final assaults, soldiers inside the town continued to hold every block, every intersection, and every fortified building. House-to-house combat persisted, but with each repelled attack, the NVA realized that the town could not be taken without unacceptable losses. By early May, after 66 days of relentless combat, the siege began to break. The aftermath revealed the enormous cost. An Locc was devastated, buildings reduced to rubble, streets scarred with craters, and the bodies of soldiers and civilians a stark reminder of the violence endured. Yet, remarkably, the town had not fallen. The defenders had held their ground against 30,000 enemy troops, tanks, and heavy artillery. The courage, determination, and ingenuity of ARVN soldiers, supported by U.S. advisors and air power, had turned what could have been a catastrophic defeat into a story of resilience and heroism. Lieutenant Colonel Luong surveyed the town from the remnants of a partially collapsed building. He saw the exhausted faces of his men, the relief in the eyes of civilians, and the smoldering ruins of a place that had become both a battlefield and a symbol of resistance. He whispered to himself, "We held, we endured, and we survived." An Lộc became a testament to the human spirit, demonstrating that even in the face of overwhelming odds, determination, courage, and unity could hold the line. The siege would enter the annals of the Vietnam War as one of the most remarkable defensive actions of the conflict, a story of heroism, suffering, and survival that would echo for decades. The Battle of An Locc was over, but its legacy endured. A small town that had withstood the might of 30,000 enemy troops, tanks, and heavy artillery, a symbol of steadfast resistance and a testament to the courage of those who refused to surrender.